Senator Lee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to each of you for being here today. Presidents of both political parties have broadly expanded beyond any reading that I believe is permissible based on the text of the 2001 and 2002 authorizations for the use of military force. In fact, I've consistently heard the 2001 AUMF referred to as the quote-unquote cornerstone of U.S. counterterrorism authorities. This despite the fact that many terrorist groups that the U.S. battles from time to time didn't exist in 2001 when Congress provided this authority, and in some cases may or may not be fairly considered offshoots of a group then in existence. Ms. Shamsi, I'd like to ask you a couple questions about this, if that's all right. Can you share with us some of the major flaws that you see in these existing authorities for purposes of future U.S. counterterrorism efforts?
Certainly, Senator Lee. And may I just begin by thanking you for the bipartisan legislation that you've introduced with respect to Congress's reassertion of its power and authority to declare war. And I'd like to start with that just because it is so incredibly important. Because as we've been talking about for 20 years now, over 20 years, successive presidents have grabbed power that belongs solely to Congress. As you know, under Article 1, only Congress has the authority to declare war, except in the event of a limited and genuine emergency, like in response to an attack or an imminent emergency where Congress does not have the time to act. And even then, the president needs to come back and seek authorization for those uses of force to continue. That is what the 1973 War Powers Resolution was supposed to do. But that safeguard against a previous era of use of force violations, that system of checks and balances is broken, Senator Lee. And your legislation, your co-sponsored legislation, recognizes that and does some very, very important things, I think. One is that it reins in presidential authority to use force. It defines important terms that had been left or were deemed ambiguous under the War Powers Resolution, like hostilities. It reins in definitions of imminence. Successive administrations have done violence to the English language as well as lives in their interpretation of what imminence means. And it provides important reporting and transparency requirements, as well as a funding cutoff, reversing the switch so that Congress itself can be the deliberative body it needs to be. And the final thing that I would add is that what we've seen now with successive interpretations of the 2001-2002 AUMF, this is an opportunity for Congress to rein in these powers and to ensure that any future AUMF it passes is defined with respect to objective, opponent, temporal limitation, and what outcomes are expected so that Congress may fulfill its role under the Constitution.
Thank you, and I appreciate your remarks regarding the bipartisan legislation that I introduced with Senator Murphy and others. That's helpful. On the time constraint in particular, considering that it's 2022 and that the 2001 AUMF is still in effect. My youngest child, my daughter Eliza, was an infant at the time the 01 AUMF was passed. So that's been in place literally her entire life, and she'll be graduating from college next year. Considering how long that one has lasted, how important would you say it is for us as a Congress to impose a time limit on future authorizations for the use of military force to make sure that we're not just creating a roving, open-ended commission to make war and vesting that power within the executive branch?
Senator Lee, I would say that it is imperative. And in fact, Congress has had more specific authorizations in the past. So Congress knows how to impose these limits when it wants to. And this ensures that the executive would come back to Congress should authorities be needed. But it's now 20 years later, proponents have to bear the burden of making the case. And we have to take into account, as a nation, the costs and consequences of war-based authorities, obviously to civilian lives, but also imperatively to our rule of law and democratic accountability.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Lee. Senator Feinstein.